Hello, health champions. Today, we're going to talk about the number one most dangerous cholesterol lie you must know. So, for several generations, we have been told that cholesterol causes heart disease. And this is arguably the number one most damaging oversimplification in modern medicine. And as a result, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world are taking statin medications, which one thing that they do, one mechanism is that they reduce the energy production in the mitochondria. And therefore, they rob the cells of energy. And the ones that get hurt the most are the ones that use the most energy. And that would be your brain, your heart, your liver, and your kidneys. And one of the biggest problems with the statin medications or any medication is that when they prescribe them to people, they say, take this will fix the problem. But it doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't make anything work better. It doesn't restore any sort of balance. It just suppresses a symptom. It suppresses something in the body. So now it's masking the real root causes and allowing those imbalances to continue to get worse. And because people are told that the pill will fix the problem, people are not so likely to make changes for themselves. So we have to change the conversation on cholesterol. We have to understand that it's not the enemy. It's not a toxin. It is something essential that your body needs, and it manufactures the vast majority of the cholesterol that the body uses. So just a quick list of a few things it does. It's a hormone precursor for the steroid hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, and cortisol. Cholesterol is a building block for vitamin D, and we are just discovering year after year how important vitamin D is. Every year there's some new discoveries. So your immune system and calcium metabolism and 100 different things depend on vitamin D, and it is critical for your cell membranes. Every cell in your body has an outer shell. It's a lipid bilayer made up of fat, and there is a mixture of essential fatty acids and saturated fatty acids and cholesterol in there. So in that membrane, there's about 20 to 25% cholesterol. And when we have the right mix of these different types of fats, now we get a balance between the membrane being fluid and the membrane having a certain stability. Cholesterol is also critical for the myelin sheath. And myelin is in your nervous system. It's a waxy covering that surrounds all your nerve fibers, and it allows the electrical impulses to travel accurately and quickly to where they need to go. And they act like insulation. When the myelin starts to break down, we can get a devastating disease called multiple sclerosis, which is when the signals aren't separated and we can start getting some short circuits in the nervous system. Cholesterol is also one of the main components of bile acids, which allow us to digest and emulsify fats. And in doing that, it allows us to properly absorb the essential fatty acids, but also the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. So cholesterol is something that is absolutely normal. It is something that your body has to have. It is something that your body manufactures. But there's quite an interesting story behind what we consider normal cholesterol and how that has changed through the years. So prior to the 1980s, anything below 300 in total cholesterol was considered normal. In fact, there was hardly any cutoff at all because you had to get way over 300 before they considered that high or before anyone sort of paid attention and considered it a problem. But then in 1987, the first statin medication, the first cholesterol-lowering medication, was approved. And the very same year, wasn't that nice of them to come out with the NCEP, and this was the first version, the National Cholesterol Education Program. Wasn't that nice of the government to come out and start educating the public on cholesterol the very same year that the first medication was available? Well, I don't think it was a coincidence. I think that is something called lobbying, where they use political pressure. They try to influence decision-makers to do their bidding. And now pretty much overnight, normal cholesterol went from 300 down to 200. So anything under 200 now was desirable. And if you were between 200 and 239, now that was considered borderline high, and anything over 240 was considered high. But not only did they start prescribing medication for people over 240, because a lot of doctors, a lot of people started getting scared. And they said, well, if I'm borderline high, then we should probably take this pill anyway. And then as we go into the 1990s, Now statin medication become mainstream. Statin medication become mainstream and we see a continued increase in the influence of big pharma of the pharmaceutical companies making statin medications, but then in 1993 we get the second version of the NCEP and they don't change the guidelines, the cutoffs for the total cholesterol, they remain where they used to be, but they're changing the focus and they're starting to look more closely at the LDL. The low-density lipoproteins, which of course is what the cholesterol-lowering medication go after. They don't go after total per se, they go after the LDLL, and now we see that less than 130 is considered desirable, 130 to 159 is borderline high, and anything over 160 is considered high. So what's happening now is that it becomes standard practice to prescribe a statin medication for anyone with a cholesterol over 200 and for an LDL over 130. And they start taking on the mentality, the idea that less is always better. If we can get it to zero, then that would be ideal, and I've had patients come into the office who had a total cholesterol of 115 and they were still on a statin medication to try to drive it lower. So now we get into the 2000s and we have more and more emphasis on the LDL cholesterol that becomes more and more of a focus, and in 2001 we get the NCEP of the third edition, and now the LDL that previously used to be good or desirable for anything under 130, now they push it even lower, so now desirable or optimal is less than 100. And between 100 and 129, that was good before. Now they call it near optimal. But of course, you understand what's happening. Now, if you're not optimal, they're going to try to prescribe a medication. And the 130 to 159 stays borderline high, and the high is the same, but then they also added one for very high. But the big difference, again, is that what used to be okay, less than 130, is not okay anymore. Now you need to get under 100. But they don't even stop there. Don't even stop there. They are saying that if you are high risk, if you have certain risk factors going on, now you should try to get your LDL under 70. So what we're seeing with each new iteration of NCEP as they go from 1, 2, to 3, we see that the limits get lower every time. But this is not based on evidence. There are not studies being conducted that clearly show that people live longer and that people get healthier. And at the same time, these medications are being marketed both to the medical doctors and to the public. But here's something that's really, really sad and really frustrated. And I get very upset when I found out, but it's still not all that surprising. In 2004, the JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, published an article that talked about how the panel for the NCEP had a conflict of interest. And what might that be? And how far-reaching might that go, you think? Well, here's the scary fact. 8 out of 9 of the panel members for the NCEP3 had financial ties to the very companies that produced these cholesterol-lowering medications. So by lowering the levels each time, they stood to make more money. So what's really happening here is that they're changing the definition of who is sick, who needs medication. So prior to 1987, there were 0 candidates for statin medication. And then as soon as they developed that medication, as soon as it was on the market, now they had to create an audience, a clientele for it. So pretty much overnight in 1987 with the NCEP they created more than 10 million customers, 10 million potential clients for their medication, and 14 years later with the NCEP3 by pushing the LDL levels low enough they had 42 million people who were now candidates, and these were people. This was a clientele that they created. And then when they had that little update to the NCEP3, where they said that LDL for high risk need to be below 70. Now in one fell swoop, they included 80 to 90% of all the men over 60. And with every update, they created tens of millions of new customers. And these customers, these people, their health hadn't changed overnight. The policies had changed, the rules, the inclusion criteria had changed. So basically what we're talking about is marketing disguised as healthcare. And I mentioned before that there's a lot of power in the lobby. And just to give you an example of how far-reaching this is, the number of voting members in Congress is 535. And then they have a certain number of lobbyists who live in the Capitol who try to influence these voting members. So do you think that there's maybe one for every 10 members of Congress? Or is there one for every? Well, it's actually 1,820 full-time lobbyists working for the pharmaceutical industry. So we're talking 4 full-time lobbyists for every single voting member of Congress. And the worst part of all is, like I said initially, that cholesterol per se is not the problem. Cholesterol is not dangerous. In fact, dangerous. In fact, over 50% of heart attacks happen to people who have cholesterol less than 200. And there was a Korean study where they basically checked the entire Korean people over a period of 10 years. Everyone who went to the doctor and they measured their cholesterol, and they found over this 10-year period that the lowest death rate in men over 65 was those who had a cholesterol between 250 and 270. So the cholesterol level that would be the lowest death rate would guarantee you a statin prescription in the United States and in many other countries too. And there are many such studies. One more is a Japanese study that showed that people who had a cholesterol of 220 to 260 lived longer than the people who had cholesterol less than 200. And the reason that over 50% of the heart attacks happen to people who have less than 200 in cholesterol is that those people still have the real root causes, which are insulin resistance, it is low-grade chronic inflammation, and it is oxidative stress. And all of these we often roll together as metabolic syndrome or poor metabolic health. So if we really want to understand what the risk markers are, we need to do different tests. And one thing that we have to start measuring is the LDL particle size. And if we have a lot of small, dense LDL, so LDL per se is not bad. If they're large and fluffy, they are perfectly fine. But if they're small and dense, as in less than 20.5 nanometers, now they're bad. Now they have been damaged. And it's not only that they're bad, but they're pointing to the fact that we have insulin resistance, oxidative stress, and inflammation. Because it's these 3 factors that make the large fluffy LDL particles start shrinking down and become dangerous. Because what these factors do is they oxidize the LDL particles and they glycate the particles. So basically, when we have high blood sugar levels, they stick to proteins on the LDL particle and they damage it. And now, because the LDL particles are much smaller, now they have a much easier time. They're much more likely to penetrate the artery wall. So the plaques don't happen inside the blood vessel. They happen inside the wall of the blood vessel. So the LDL particles have to get small so that they can get into the muscle, into behind the lining of the wall. And now also, because these LDL particles are damaged, they're not normal anymore. They look like foreign particles. They don't look like healthy, fluffy LDL. And now they attract something called a macrophage, which is part of our immune system. And these macrophages are designed to clean out foreign intruders and cells that don't look right. And then these macrophages are designed to clean out foreign intruders and cells that don't look right. And then these macrophages, they gobble up the small damaged LDL particles and they become foam cells. And that is what makes up the plaque inside the artery wall. So we have to understand that, yes, it is a little bit about LDL, but it's not all LDL. It is not normal, fluffy, healthy LDL. It is damaged LDL. And what causes the damage is insulin resistance, oxidative stress, and inflammation. And the statin medication are not going to do anything to reverse those. So when you get that test that counts the LDL particles and the size of them, it's very different than the test that measures how many milligrams of LDL you have. So when you get the test that counts, now you want to find out the size and the number of LDL particles. And ideally, your total count should be less than 1,000. But that's not so super important because you could still be healthy and have 1,500 or even 2,000. But what's more important is the percentage of small LDL particles. Is the percentage of small LDL particles. And in my opinion, that should be less than 20% of the total LDL particles should be small, should be less than 20.5 nanometers. And why is that? Because if that percentage is higher, and very often we'll see 50% or 60% that are small. That means the reason that the percentage is so high is that you have a lot of damaged particles and you have a lot of insulin resistance, oxidative stress, and inflammation. But remember how we said that the statin medication specifically reduces LDL. So we should be taking care of here, right? Well, not really, because the statin medication works two ways. And the first is that it interferes with a pathway where the body makes cholesterol. So by interfering in that pathway, we're going to reduce the production. We're going to not be able to make as much LDL cholesterol. But the LDL that we manufacture, that is the fluffy LDL. That's the large, normal LDL before it gets damaged. But then the second way that the medication works is it increases the number of LDL receptors on the liver. So we're going to reabsorb more also. So there's two ways we lower the LDL cholesterol, but in both cases, we're making less and we're reabsorbing more of the fluffy of the normal LDL. But here's the problem, that the small LDL, the damaged LDL, which is the harmful one that we're really trying to get rid of, remember how I said that the macrophages go after that LDL because it's altered. It's not recognized by these receptors anymore. The receptors can't pull in the bad small LDL, but it only pulls in the large and fluffy. So the small LDL is not affected. So when we run our blood test, if we just do the usual test, the standard test, it's going to show a dramatically lower level of LDL in terms of milligrams per deciliter, but if we also run the more sophisticated test and measure the particles, now we're going to see that the number of small LDL does not go down. And in fact, the percentage is going up because we're lowering the number of fluffy LDL, but we're not doing anything to reduce the small particles because we still have the inflammation, we still have the oxidative stress, and we still have the insulin resistance. And therefore, all the particles still keep getting damaged. But even on the standard test, there are a few things that we really want to pay attention to. And one is total cholesterol to HDL cholesterol ratio. And it's not my favorite, but it's still very useful. So for example, if your total cholesterol is 210 and your HDL is 70, now you have a ratio of 3.0, and that is very good. And if our total goes up to 240 and our HDL goes down to 60, now that ratio would be 4, and we are still going to be good as long as the other markers don't look too terrible. But on the other hand, if we have a total cholesterol of 180 and an HDL of 30, then that's a ratio of 6, and that is high risk. And we see that a low HDL number is almost always associated with a higher degree of inflammation and oxidative stress. But then we're also going to have people who have much higher numbers like 300 over 75, 300 total 75 HDL, and the ratio now is 4. But these people are most of the time going to be perfectly fine as long as the other markers that we're talking about look good. And then we're going to have a lot of people who have much higher numbers like 300 total and 75 HDL. So the ratio now would be 4.0. And I would still say that this person is, for the most part, they're going to be okay. But you want to start looking at some other markers and make sure that you understand what they're telling you, that they're in a good range. And here's one more marker that I like even better than the previous, which is triglycerides to HDL ratio. To HDL ratio. And the reason I like this even better is that triglycerides are such a strong indicator of insulin resistance and metabolic disease. So generally today, when we look at this ratio among people who do functional medicine, they find that a low risk is anyone who's less than 2 and high risk would be anyone over 3.5. So for example, if you have 150 in total triglycerides, but your HDL is 75, now you would be at 2.0 and you would be okay. But here's what I have found over a number of years in my personal numbers and virtually all the people that I check that are on a low-carb diet and who have become insulin sensitive. I find that even though they're talking about a normal triglyceride level being all the way up to 150 or even 200, I find that on low carbs, your triglycerides are typically going to run between 50 and 80. And for most people, if your HDL is between 50 and 70, then you're going to find a ratio of around 1. So yes, you do definitely want to be below 2, but I find that people on low carb are typically much less than that. And just for comparison, the NCEP guidelines, the first one didn't really talk about triglycerides at all, or HDL. On 2 and 3, they started mentioning it, but there wasn't a lot of emphasis, but they said that a borderline triglycerides would be around 200, and then if you had an HDL of 40, which was kind of borderline, now that ratio would be 5, which is way higher and above the high risk level and even what they considered ideal, which would be 150 of triglycerides and an HDL of 60, which they consider highly protective. Now you're still going to have a ratio of 2.5, which is above that ideal level of 2.0. And then there are some other good markers that you want to include if you can. And one is called high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And an optimum level there is less than 1. Now you want to be a little careful, because if you go and take a standard lab test, their cutoff is at 3. And that's what you want to understand between standard lab ranges and optimal lab ranges. And I made a blood work course where I go through all of that in detail. But the 3.0 is where you get a flag. But if you're at 2.9, the regular lab range, they're not going to flag anything. They're not going to tell you that you're anything other than optimal. And then you want to order one of my absolute favorite tests called fasting insulin. And chances are that when you go to your healthcare provider and you say you want to test your fasting insulin, they're going to roll their eyes and say that you've been watching some YouTube doctor who don't know what they're talking about. Their eyes and say that you've been watching some YouTube doctor who don't know what they're talking about, and it's a useless test. But it is a very useful test, and if they won't give it to you, then order it for yourself somehow. It is the best marker, the simplest marker for insulin resistance. And you want to be optimally between 2 and 5. But here's the kicker. The flag is not going to come up until you're over 25. So you're basically going to be a type 2 full-blown diabetic before you have a flag on the test for one of the simplest markers there is. For the best marker there is for insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And then for good measure, you want to throw in hemoglobin A1C. That's your best marker for your long-term blood sugar control. And an ideal range is between 4.8 and 5.3. When you get up to get a flag, that's at 5.7. And that's the level for pre-diabetes, meaning if you don't change your lifestyle, you'll probably be diabetic in 5 years. And then the A1C for diabetes is 6.5. But you really want to try to keep it below 5.3 because that's where you're insulin sensitive. That's where you have excellent blood sugar control. And another great marker is called homocysteine. It's a byproduct of liver metabolism. And we're supposed to convert certain metabolites and the liver makes homocysteine, then it's supposed to break it down again. But if we're missing certain things, certain methylation factors and some B vitamins, now the homocysteine builds up and it becomes very inflammatory. So a good level is less than 7. Good level is less than 7, but again the lab is not going to flag it until you're over 15, and that is way too high. So by getting these tested you are getting better and earlier warnings than you ever could by measuring total cholesterol and total LDL. So we have to get a little bit more in tune with natural law. We have to respect our bodies and the wisdom and the intelligence that's built in. And cholesterol is not the enemy, because the body would not make so much of it if it was a bad thing. And like I've said so many times in this video and others, what messes up the system is insulin resistance, it is metabolic dysfunction, it is oxidative stress and inflammation. And what causes those is from an unnatural lifestyle. We don't respect nature, so we live unnatural lifestyles, and we don't even understand what real food is anymore. We've introduced all these strange things such as excess sugar, excess alcohol, seed oils, chemicals, heavy metals, electromagnetic fields, and we have a lack of movement, and we have a lack of sleep and fresh air. And it's not to say that there is never a time for medication, but for the vast majority of people, you are much better off if you start understanding the real risk factors, you start living a natural lifestyle, you address the root causes, and you bring the real risk markers into an optimal range. Then the vast majority of people are not going to need to rely on medication. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.